I'd like to open this video by saying that we're beyond the well-documented Operation Choke Point effects. I have no evidence that the FDIC has forced anything we're about to talk about. I would note, though, that this is exactly how Operation Choke Point was originally exposed. While no one would listen to the payday lenders when they said they were having problems, the porn stars and gun industry got traction in the media from mass denials with no obvious direct connections. In short, take this with a grain of salt, but what I see is too far beyond coincidental for my liking. For those that have been around YouTube for a long time, the adpocalypse isn't new. In fact, it's years old. Depending on who you talk to, it either started in 2012 or 2015. I would note, however, that while the 2012 starting of demonetization was irritating at best for the creator community, it was the 2015 demonetizations that created the adpocalypse name, and when nearly every creator began to have real problems with the ad system. With that in mind, this graph demonstrates, rather acutely, exactly when the adpocalypse started, late August or early September 2015. The adpocalypse coincided rather well with our previously described list of risky behaviors. It's also worth noting that gun channels were hit pretty hard in the demonetization and even deplatforming around this time. For example, Hickok 45 was banned on January 3, 2016. Of course, YouTube has, effectively always, had rules against pornography, so it's impossible to tell if there was stricter enforcement on this subject. At this point, it seems all too obvious that YouTube has no connection to the FDIC, and so even if the FDIC were pursuing this endeavor, the connection is too tenuous, and we're in the land of conspiracy theory. On the other hand, dear skeptical viewer, I would direct you to the fact that almost exactly 6 months after the adpocalypse began, Google Wallet was confirmed to be covered by FDIC insurance. This seems like a good time to discuss the FDIC timeline for getting a license to be insured. While the documentation doesn't specify what these alternative payment providers, their term, wait, it does give us a general timeline of 30 to 120 days for a license of any kind. That might seem rather short compared to the 6 months between the beginning of the adpocalypse and the FDIC approval, and I would agree, except that the FDIC has an application handbook that's illuminating on many subjects here. Looking in the FDIC handbook, we find the FDIC encouraging anyone planning on getting a license to have a pre-filing meeting in which they can discuss becoming compliant with FDIC policy and applicable laws. While this application guide is clearly intended for banks filing for FDIC insurance, it equally addresses, quote, non-bank, end quote, entities as well. Non-bank entities are a broad category that effectively comes down to anything not a traditional brick-and-mortar bank, a category that clearly includes our alternative payment providers. If we take a glance to slightly older files from the FDIC, we find them interested in regulating these industries all the way back to winter 2012. This article specifically mentions all of our usual suspects in the deplatforming issues: Google's mobile wallet, PayPal, Apple. If I may take a moment, this may entirely explain why the left-right dichotomy doesn't seem to apply to the deplatformings, but some abstract idea of the progressive agenda does seem to apply. If we go back to the original list of risky behaviors, we find a much clearer line with the people deplatformed or even hit by the adpocalypse than we do in left versus right. Equally, it's worth noting that Operation Choke Point was a political endeavor that was generally in favor of and started by the Obama administration. Back to social media. Assuming you accept the thesis here, this, at least tenuously, could explain YouTube's various censorship policies. YouTube is far from the only company censoring and or deplatforming. If we take a look into Gab getting kicked off the app stores, various payment processors, and anyone touching those payment processors, GoDaddy uses Stripe as a payment processor, it might be time to take a look into those companies. We've already covered Google, so what happened with Apple? If we look to the bank backing Apple Pay, Green Dot Bank, we find they require following the FDIC terms of service to be a part of either the bank or Apple Pay. This all seems obvious, but I'd also note that Gab was kicked off the Stripe payment processor system, also regulated by the FDIC. All of these things are more than a little coincidental, but the final nail in the coffin for me was that Coinbase, the Bitcoin wallet, kicked Gab off their service as well. Certainly a Bitcoin wallet isn't subject to the FDIC. Wrong. Coinbase applied for a banking license in May of 2018. As of recording this video, Coinbase, under their legal section, describes USD of US customers as held in FDIC-insured bank accounts and are thus FDIC-insured. It would appear that anywhere the FDIC has influence, Gab can gain no traction. Once again, if we look to the, quote, high-risk behavior, end quote, Gab engages in many, but the innumerable articles about it being filled with racism are likely all that was ever needed. As I've thus far not said why Stripe de facto counts as being attached to the FDIC, let me explain. They are a subsidiary of Wells Fargo, and their own terms of service, while seemingly not public, are included in a few other people's sites to explain the terms to those companies' user bases. To comply with the terms for Stripe, one must comply with the terms of Wells Fargo, and as such, the terms of the FDIC. Moving on, we have Milo Yiannopoulos, who was kicked off PayPal and Venmo in June 2018. I'm sure many don't know, but Venmo is a subsidiary of PayPal, a subsidiary that settled a suit with the Federal Trade Commission in which they were found to have misled users when they said they had, quote, bank-grade security systems, end quote. The settlement occurred on February 27, 2018. So on April 9th, PayPal announced they were planning, quote, banking features like FDIC insurance, end quote. 2 months later, Milo was kicked off PayPal and Venmo. If we were to fast forward to the Alex Jones removal from YouTube, Facebook, and Apple, it was met with much speculation about collusion between Silicon Valley companies. The theory is compelling, and I'm certainly not here to say that said collusion is impossible. I would equally concede that these companies are likely not fighting any of this. I would equally concede that they are probably happy to enforce these policies. That all said, back to the point. Jones was deplatformed from all the aforementioned companies in less than 24 hours. These companies all claimed there was no collusion, and for obvious reasons, we all doubted them. In light of the rest of this, it seems worthy to talk about Facebook at this point. While I'm certain there are 1,000 ways the government could tell Facebook to get rid of Alex Jones, it's worth noting that in 2007, Facebook started a service to send friends money on Facebook. That service requires that the user have a US bank account with a Visa or MasterCard debit card attached. Equally, their service seems to use a wide variety of payment processors, but Facebook seems reticent to specify which ones. I'm in no way certain that this even permitted the FDIC to compel Facebook to do anything, so this may be actual collusion. Not to mention that Mark Zuckerberg is possibly one of the worst people on the planet. With the rest of this series in mind, I would forward the idea that the collusion was not required because the FDIC has its tendrils into all these companies. While this doesn't inherently remove the possibility of the companies colluding, and they certainly have an incentive to say they aren't, it does fit rather well into the Operation Choke Point tactics and objectives. This brings us to the most recent banning of Sargon of Akkad from Patreon. As discussed in the third video of this series, the hallmarks are all there. Patreon is very much subject to the whims of PayPal and Stripe, as those are its primary, if not only, payment processors. I won't rehash the points from the prior video, but this seems like a good time to discuss the attempted fix to the issue, the move to Subscribestar. Subscribestar is, or was, a direct competitor to Patreon in nearly every way. It seems an obvious solution to Patreon banning people. The issue, under the circumstances, would seem to be that the payment processors once again ripped support from someone that had been unpersoned by the powers that be. Seemingly, with the order already issued, the payment processors knew what to do and immediately removed support from Subscribestar. This sounds distinctly like what happened to Gab. Subscribestar says they have a new payment processor lined up, but they have as yet to name them. It's worth noting at this point that Square, the only unnamed major processor in this series, applied for a banking license on December 19, 2018. This was after they had been kept in limbo on a license that was submitted in September 2017 and revoked earlier in the year 2018. It's equally worth noting that Square Incorporated is led by Jack Dorsey, CEO of Twitter, the only major social media company unnamed thus far. For those wondering, it's approximately mid-December 2017 we begin to see articles about Twitter purging the Nazis, and the change in their terms of service to mandate their users weren't associated with hate groups. It has been a near constant purge since that time in regards to Twitter users. While there certainly were bans, and high-profile ones at that, before that time, there were not the mass purges we have seen since. I would like to go back to the beginning of this video for a moment. I have no evidence that these things were perpetrated by the FDIC. Certainly there are other worthwhile theories for these bans. If one were to go back through the dates, they would notice that they coincide fairly well with federal U.S. elections. To that, I'd remind you that Operation Choke Point was a political hit squad enforcing the will of the Obama administration, and that the people who executed it are still in their positions. It's entirely possible that this is just backlash from companies lobbied by SJWs or whatever. To that, I'd remind you that even the likes of the Young Turks have been hit by demonetizations, and any number of progressives have been kicked off of various funding platforms. It could be that this is all a coincidence and I'm reading too much into it. I find that unlikely myself, but I simply cannot prove this idea wrong. Up next, we'll be examining the players. I'm not sure when that video will be out. The series has been intensely draining, and we are still putting out the regular Friday show this week. If I don't get it made beforehand, it will probably be out this weekend. Thank you for watching.